We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
For a brief period in American history, the White House felt like a fairy tale. A young, handsome president with a brilliant wife, beautiful children, and a vision for the country that made people feel like anything was possible. They called it Camelot, and they meant it as a compliment. But behind the velvet curtain of that beautiful image, a very different story was unfolding. One involving a mob boss, a Hollywood icon, a murdered socialite, and a 19-year-old intern who kept a secret for 40 years. This is John F. Kennedy, the affairs that destroyed Camelot's perfect image. The man they called Jack. To understand why the affairs of John F. Kennedy shocked an entire country, you have to first understand the scale of what people believed they were seeing. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, into the most ambitious family in American political life. The Kennedys of Brookline, Massachusetts, were Catholic, wealthy, and driven by a ferocity of purpose that came directly from the patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy, a man who had made his fortune in banking, film, and by some accounts considerably less respectable pursuits, and who had spent decades engineering the political rise of his sons with the focus of someone building a dynasty. Joe Kennedy had served as ambassador to the United Kingdom under Franklin Roosevelt and had harbored presidential ambitions of his own that were eventually foreclosed, leaving him to channel everything into his children instead. The pressure he placed on those children was, by every account, extraordinary. A combination of love, expectation, and competitive intensity that shaped them in ways both magnificent and damaging. Jack was the second of 9 children. He was bright, charming, physically striking, and by his own and others' accounts, possessed of a particular quality that is very difficult to manufacture: the ability to make every person in a room feel like the most important person he had ever encountered. He had attended Choate Preparatory School in Connecticut, graduated from Harvard, and served in the Pacific Theater during World War II in a manner that produced genuine heroism. His PT boat was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in August 1943, and Kennedy swam through dark water, towing an injured crew member by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth to reach safety on a nearby island. He was decorated for his actions and later wrote a book about the experience. He entered Congress as a representative from Massachusetts in 1947, moved to the Senate in 1953, won the Pulitzer Prize for Profiles in Courage in 1957, and launched his presidential campaign in January 1960, at the age of 42. When he defeated Richard Nixon in the November election, one of the closest in American history, he became the youngest person ever elected to the office. At his inauguration on January 20th, 1961, he delivered one of the most remembered speeches in American political history, asking citizens not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. The image was complete, and the image was powerful. The young president and his luminous wife, Jacqueline, the children playing in the Oval Office, the touch football on the White House lawn, the poetry readings, and the string quartets, and the sense that intellect and elegance had returned to American public life. Jackie Kennedy herself coined the term Camelot in an interview given just days after her husband's assassination in November 1963, describing the Kennedy White House as a brief, shining moment in the manner of the legendary court of King Arthur. She gave that interview to journalist Theodore H. White of Life magazine, and she was deliberate and composed during it in a way that suggests she understood exactly what she was doing. She was building a monument, and she intended it to last. But there was a private life behind the public one that bore almost no resemblance to the Camelot story. Kennedy had been conducting affairs since long before he reached the presidency, during his time in the Navy, during his years in Congress, during his marriage. He is reported to have told friends that he required intimate encounters on a daily basis, that his body and his psychology demanded it in a way that felt as real and insistent to him as any other physical need. He told colleagues at various points that going without made him physically uncomfortable. The people around him, his aides, his Secret Service detail, his personal assistants, managed the logistics of his private life with a professionalism and discretion that was itself a kind of organizational achievement. They operated what amounted to a parallel scheduling function, coordinating women, managing access, ensuring that the machinery of the public presidency was never visibly contaminated by the machinery of the private one. Jackie Kennedy was not unaware. She was, by multiple accounts, a deeply sophisticated and privately quite clear-eyed woman who had understood what she was marrying and had made a calculation about it. She had come from an aristocratic family. Her father, John Black Jack Bouvier, had been a renowned stockbroker and a womanizer of considerable energy, and she had grown up watching how that operated within a family. She maintained her dignity with remarkable consistency. She did not speak publicly about her husband's behavior during his lifetime or in the immediate years after his death. But those who knew her well said she was fully cognizant of what was happening, and that the one affair that truly got under her skin, the one that provoked a response close to outrage, was the most famous one, the one with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe, the performance that changed everything. She was the most photographed woman in America, possibly on Earth, and she was also, by every account of those who knew her well, one of the most emotionally fragile. A woman of extraordinary natural gifts, who had spent most of her adult life feeling fundamentally unseen by the people whose attention she most needed. Kennedy was formally introduced to Marilyn Monroe at a dinner party in New York in February 1962, organized by Peter Lawford, the British actor who was both a member of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack and Kennedy's brother-in-law through his marriage to Patricia Kennedy. Monroe was more than an hour late. She was notoriously late for everything, and apparently the presence of the President of the United States waiting for her was not sufficient to change the habit. When she finally arrived, the room divided. One guest who was there recalled the moment as something close to a physical event. The crowd parting, everyone wanting to be near her, wanting to occupy the same air. Actress Arlene Dahl, who was present, later described how the president turned around when Monroe walked in, and everyone could see immediately that he was attracted. Another guest recalled how Monroe walked through the room, and everything simply stopped. Kennedy noticed her immediately. He reportedly took her arm, guided her to the table, and the following day called her and asked if she would meet him in Palm Springs when he came to California in March. He mentioned that Jackie would not be there. The nature and extent of what followed between them has been debated by historians and biographers for decades. One of Monroe's close friends later said, describing what Monroe herself had shared, that the weekend in March at Bing Crosby's house in Palm Springs was the sum total of the physical relationship, that it happened once, that weekend, and not more, and that it was not, in Monroe's own telling, a major event for either of them. Others have reported more. The White House phone logs from 1962 show numerous calls from Monroe, a Rolex watch engraved with a personal inscription, carrying an intimate message along with the date May 29, 1962, was presented to Kennedy through an aide, and Kennedy reportedly told the aide to get rid of it the moment he saw it. The watch later sold at auction for $120,000. Whether the relationship was brief or more sustained, certain things are not in dispute. On May 19, 1962, 10 days before his actual 45th birthday, Marilyn Monroe appeared at a fundraising gala at Madison Square Garden in New York and sang Happy Birthday to the President in a manner that has no real historical equivalent. She wore a dress sewn so tightly to her body that it was practically transparent under the stage lights, and she delivered the song in a breathy, intimate whisper that left the audience of 15,000 people in a kind of stunned silence before erupting into applause. Kennedy walked to the microphone afterward and said, with a grin, that he could now retire from politics after having had happy birthdays sung to him in such a sweet and wholesome manner. Jackie Kennedy was not at Madison Square Garden that night. She was attending a horse show in Virginia. Whether her absence was a choice or a coincidence has never been definitively established, but those who were close to the first couple said it was not an accident. She had reportedly been deeply unhappy about Monroe's increasing attempts to insert herself into the president's life. Calls to the White House, requests to visit Washington, a letter allegedly written to Jackie herself that implied Monroe harbored ambitions of replacing her as First Lady. Jackie's response to her husband, when he assured her that Monroe meant nothing to him, was said to be dry and pointed, telling him that if Monroe wanted to take over the White House, the responsibilities of First Lady were entirely available to her. Kennedy's close associates said he had already distanced himself from Monroe by this point. His view of her, according to friends who later spoke about it, was that she was genuinely sweet, but also, by the spring of 1962, genuine trouble. Someone who wanted things from the relationship that he was neither able nor willing to provide, and whose emotional fragility made her a complication that a sitting president could not afford. But Monroe herself was in a deteriorating state that went well beyond any calculation Kennedy might have made about her. Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller had ended in January 1961. Her next film, Something's Got to Give, had collapsed in production. She had been fired by 20th Century Fox in June 1962, a dismissal that was both humiliating and financially disastrous. She was struggling with the dependencies that had shadowed her career for years, and the people around her were increasingly frightened for her. She had become one of the patients of Dr. Max Jacobson, known to his celebrity clientele as Dr. Feelgood, whose injections combined vitamins with amphetamines and other substances that were not disclosed to the people receiving them. On August 5, 1962, Monroe was found unresponsive at her home in Los Angeles. She was 36 years old. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled the cause of death as probable acute barbiturate poisoning, the manner of death classified as probable suicide. Phone records from her final days became a subject of intense speculation in the years and decades that followed. She had made numerous calls in the hours before her death, and the full picture of those conversations has never been made entirely clear. The rumors that have attached themselves to that night, involving both Kennedy brothers, involving surveillance, involving people being dispatched to her home, have never been confirmed and have never been fully dismissed. What is confirmed is that one of the most famous women in the world was found dead in her bedroom, and that the Kennedys' names were in the conversation before the body had been removed. The Marilyn Monroe episode was the most public and most culturally charged of Kennedy's affairs, but the one with the most genuinely dangerous implications. The one that, if it had broken fully into public view during his presidency, might have ended everything, was the one that came with organized crime attached. Judith Campbell Exner, the woman who knew too much. She was introduced to Senator John F. Kennedy on February 7, 1960, at a party in Las Vegas hosted by Frank Sinatra. The senator was 42 years old and preparing to announce his presidential candidacy. Judith Campbell was 25, a striking woman from Pacific Palisades who had been raised in an affluent California family and had spent her 20s moving through the social circles of Hollywood and the entertainment industry. She had been married to and divorced from actor William Campbell, and she was, by her own and everyone else's account, genuinely beautiful. The connection between Kennedy and Sinatra had been well established for years. Kennedy admired the glamour and the access that the Rat Pack represented, and Sinatra cultivated the presidential connection with an enthusiasm that suited his own image. He was close to the mob. Everyone in his world knew it, and many considered it a feature rather than a flaw. And the party circuit he ran through Las Vegas and Los Angeles routinely mixed celebrities, politicians, and organized crime figures in a way that people of that era apparently found entirely natural. A few weeks after meeting Kennedy, Campbell met Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the United States, at another gathering arranged by Sinatra. He was introduced to her as Sam Flood. She did not know he was Sam Giancana. She said this consistently and for the rest of her life. She had no idea who she was really meeting. What followed was one of the most consequential personal entanglements in American presidential history. Campbell and Kennedy began an affair that continued for roughly 2 years, including after he was elected president in November 1960. By her own account, documented in her 1977 memoir and supported by phone logs, Secret Service records, and White House documentation, she visited Kennedy at the White House on more than 20 occasions. They met in hotel rooms. They met at the Georgetown house he shared with Jackie. They spoke by phone regularly, with calls going through Kennedy's personal secretary Evelyn Lincoln. During this same period, Campbell had also entered into a personal relationship with Giancana, whom she had come to know as Sam Flood before his identity was revealed. Giancana knew about her relationship with Kennedy. Kennedy knew about her relationship with Giancana. And both of them, Campbell would later claim, understood her as a channel between them, carrying messages, arranging meetings, passing envelopes. The implications of this are almost impossible to overstate. The President of the United States and the most powerful organized crime boss in the country were in contact, through a mutual intimate, during a period when the Kennedy administration's official posture was to wage aggressive legal war on organized crime under Attorney General Robert Kennedy's direction. The CIA was simultaneously working with Giancana on covert operations to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. The whole arrangement had the quality of something from a thriller novel, except that it was real, and it was happening at the highest levels of American government. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, knew. Hoover had been building files on powerful people for decades. It was how he maintained his own power, by knowing things that others didn't want known and making sure those others understood he knew. The information he accumulated on Kennedy's personal life, including the Campbell connection, gave him a lever he was not shy about using. He had already been monitoring Giancana through extensive FBI surveillance operations, and Campbell's movement between the mob boss and the president had been captured in those surveillance records in considerable detail. On March 22, 1962, Hoover had lunch with Kennedy at the White House. The exact substance of their conversation has never been fully documented, but what happened immediately afterward is recorded. Kennedy cut off contact with Judith Campbell. He also, in a move whose timing was unmistakable, cancelled his plans to stay at Frank Sinatra's house during an upcoming California trip, and stayed instead at the home of Bing Crosby, a Republican, and someone with no organized crime associations whatsoever. The message to Sinatra, who had spent months renovating his Palm Springs compound in anticipation of the presidential visit, was received exactly as it was intended. The friendship between Kennedy and Sinatra, which had been publicly celebrated and politically useful, was effectively over. Sinatra's reaction, according to people close to him, was one of pure devastation. He had invested enormous personal capital in the relationship and felt genuinely betrayed by the abrupt withdrawal. There is also the question of what Hoover got in exchange. The FBI director had long been pressuring Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, for authorization to surveil Martin Luther King Jr., claiming that King had communist connections. Robert Kennedy was resistant. After Hoover's March 1962 lunch with the president, the surveillance authorization eventually came through. The precise chain of cause and effect has never been definitively established, but the timing has been noted by historians repeatedly. Campbell went on to survive in a world that had become genuinely frightening. Giancana was murdered in his Oak Park home in 1975, the night before he was to testify before a Senate committee about the CIA's attempts to assassinate Castro. Johnny Roselli, another mob figure connected to the same network, was found in a steel drum floating in Biscayne Bay in 1976 after he had given his own testimony to Congress. Campbell began sleeping with a gun under her pillow. She published her memoir in 1977 and was initially attacked by Kennedy loyalists and dismissed by journalists. In the decades that followed, as FBI documents were declassified and White House logs were examined, her core account was increasingly vindicated. A correction issued by the New York Times in her obituary in 1999 acknowledged that respected historians had come to view the affair as having indeed taken place, citing White House phone logs and Hoover's own memos as supporting evidence. She died of cancer at 65, still insisting, as she had always insisted, that she had loved Kennedy, that at 26 she had been in love, and that faced with the President of the United States in that position, anyone might have done the same. The Campbell affair was the one that carried political and national security consequences that historians are still working to fully understand. But the affair that carried the most raw human cost, the one whose ending was the most haunting, involved a woman who died not from a dependence tragedy, but from a bullet on a quiet afternoon walk. Mary Pinchot Meyer, the diary, the CIA, and the unsolved murder. She was not a starlet or an intern. She was a painter, a Washington socialite, a Vassar-educated woman of considerable intelligence who moved through the highest levels of American power with the ease of someone who had grown up near them. She was also the sister-in-law of Ben Bradlee, the man who would eventually become the executive editor of the Washington Post, the paper that would break Watergate, the paper that was then Newsweek's Washington bureau, the paper whose editor was among the president's closest personal friends. Mary Pinchot Meyer had known Kennedy since they were both young. They had crossed paths in their prep school years and moved in overlapping social circles for decades. She had been married to Cord Meyer, a senior CIA official and one of the agency's most powerful counterintelligence figures, until their divorce in 1958. After the divorce, she moved into a Georgetown studio and took up painting seriously, building a life among Washington's intellectual and political elite that was, by every account, full and independent and interesting. Her affair with Kennedy began sometime in 1961 or 1962, after he was already in the White House and after the deaths of both of her children's crises had passed. The relationship was different in character from Kennedy's other involvements. People who knew both of them described it as genuinely mutual, intellectually engaged, and emotionally significant to the president in ways that his other affairs were not. One of Kennedy's close associates described it as the one that was actually replacing the Marilyn Monroe involvement, the relationship he turned to after Monroe had become what he called trouble, someone who wanted things he couldn't give. Meyer is said to have had real conversations with Kennedy about policy, about the Cold War, about the direction of American foreign policy. There were claims, though they have never been conclusively established, that she had introduced him to marijuana and that they had shared other substances together. These claims come primarily from the diary she kept, which described their evenings in detail, and which became the object of one of the stranger and more unsettling episodes in the history of the Washington establishment. In October 1963, 1 month before Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, he wrote her a letter that has since been authenticated by experts and sold at auction. The letter, written on White House stationery and addressed to her directly, is unmistakably personal, unmistakably romantic, and unmistakably the letter of a man who wanted her presence and was asking for it with an openness that he rarely showed anywhere else. Kennedy was killed in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Mary Pinchot Meyer survived him by less than a year. On October 12, 1964, on a bright early autumn afternoon, Meyer finished work in her Georgetown studio and went for her customary walk along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath, a popular path near the Potomac River that she sometimes walked with Jacqueline Kennedy. At approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, she was shot twice at close range. She died at the scene. There was no apparent motive. Her purse was not taken. A man was arrested near the scene, a man named Ray Crump Jr., who was found soaking wet and claimed he had fallen into the river while fishing. No gun was ever found. No forensic evidence linking Crump to the crime was ever presented. At trial, he was acquitted. The murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer has never been solved. What happened in the hours and days after her death was, in its own way, nearly as extraordinary as the murder itself. Meyer had confided to friends that she kept a diary, a document that described her relationship with Kennedy in considerable detail. Her sister, Antoinette, known as Tony, was married to Ben Bradley. Tony knew about the diary. The Bradleys knew that the diary existed and that it needed to be found. On the evening of her death, while the Bradleys were still processing the shock of what had happened, Tony received a call from Anne Truitt, a friend of Meyer's who was in Tokyo at the time. Truitt told Tony that Mary had told her about the diary and had asked that, if anything happened to her, it be kept and eventually shown to her son. Tony and Ben Bradley went to Meyer's Georgetown studio to find it. When they arrived, James Jesus Angleton was already there. Angleton was the head of counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the most powerful and feared intelligence officials in America, a man whose job was secrets, whose specialty was knowing what other people knew. He was also a family friend, and he had known Mary Meyer for years. He had been tapping her telephone since she separated from Cord Meyer, her CIA husband, years earlier. Bradley later described arriving at the studio and finding Angleton working through it in the dark, systematically. They found the diary together. Tony located it, slim, around 50 to 60 pages, mostly about paintings, but with 10 or so pages that described the affair with Kennedy. They read it. Bradley described himself as stunned. He had known Kennedy, had been close to him, and Kennedy had always denied the affairs to Ben directly, even while, apparently, conducting one with his sister-in-law. The diary was handed to Angleton, who promised to destroy it. Whether he actually did remains a matter of dispute. His wife and a mutual friend later stated that he had burned some documents and safeguarded others. The diary itself has never surfaced. Mary Pinchot Meyer was 43 years old when she was killed. Her murder was, and remains, one of the most haunting, unresolved questions in the history of the Kennedy era. A woman who knew the president intimately, who kept a written record of what she knew, who was shot in broad daylight with no apparent motive 1 year to the month after his assassination. The theories about what happened and why have never stopped circulating, and the CIA's presence at her studio on the night of her death has never been given a fully satisfying explanation. But the most structurally strange and institutionally unsettling affair that Kennedy conducted was not with a global icon or a mobster's acquaintance or a Washington socialite. It was with someone who worked in his own building, who was, in fact, assigned there by his own staff, and who was a college student when it began. Mimi Alford, the secret kept for 40 years. Her name at the time was Mimi Beardsley. She was 19 years old, a sophomore at Wheaton College from Middletown Township in New Jersey. She had been raised in the kind of quietly privileged household that produced young women who attended schools like Miss Porter's in Connecticut, who knew the right people and moved in the right social circles, and who had grown up with very clear ideas about how one behaved. She had never had a serious relationship. She had never had a sexual experience of any kind. In the summer of 1962, she was offered an internship in the White House press office. She accepted and arrived in Washington. 4 days into her internship, she was approached by Dave Powers, Kennedy's personal aide and one of his closest companions. Powers asked if she would like to join a small group for a swim in the White House pool. It was an enclosed pool, private, entirely within the residence. When she arrived, there were 2 other young female staffers and Kennedy himself. They swam. Later that day, she was invited to a cocktail party in the residence. Powers had kept her glass filled with daiquiris through much of the afternoon. Kennedy offered her a personal tour of the White House. He led her into Jackie's bedroom. The First Lady was not in Washington that day. And there, in Jackie Kennedy's bedroom, on Mimi Beardsley's 4th day working in the building, Kennedy initiated the first sexual encounter of her life. In her memoir, published in 2011 under the title Once Upon a Secret, Alford described the power imbalance of the situation with a clarity that came from decades of processing what had happened. She was, by her own account, entirely unprepared for the force of a president's attention turned directly on a 19-year-old who had no experience of men, no frame of reference for what was being offered to her, and no real ability to decline the interest of the most powerful person in the world. She said, in a television interview promoting the book, that she would not call it non-consensual, but she acknowledged that she had no idea whether she could have resisted, and that the very question may have been beyond her at the time. The affair lasted 18 months. During that time, Beardsley was called back to the White House from Wheaton College, accompanied the president on trips, and was part of a loose circle of young women who traveled with Kennedy and were managed, in terms of logistics and discretion, by Powers and other aides. She always called him Mr. President. She was involved with him through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13 days in October 1962 when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, and she remained accessible to him through the following year. She kept the secret for more than 40 years. She kept it through the assassination, which she learned about, like everyone else, from a news report. She had a first marriage that eventually collapsed, partly under the weight of a secret she could never quite share. She built a life, raised daughters, became a grandmother. She worked as a church administrator in New York City. In 2003, the historian Robert Dallek, while researching his major biography of Kennedy, came across a 1964 oral history interview at the JFK Presidential Library given by Barbara Gamarekian, a former White House press aide. In the interview, Gamarekian described, in oblique but unmistakable terms, an intern in the press office who had a special relationship with the president. A girl who, as Gamarekian put it memorably, couldn't type. Dallek included a brief reference to Mimi in his biography. The press took it from there. The New York Daily News ran a front-page headline, "JFK had a moniker." Alford's identity was established within days. She confirmed the affair in a public statement, and then, rather than simply absorb the exposure, she wrote the book. Not, she said, to profit from the story, but to take control of it, to tell it in her own words before others told it for her. The book sold enormously, spent weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and reopened conversations about the Kennedy White House that had never been fully closed. Alford's account was corroborated, to the extent that oral history and institutional records can corroborate a personal relationship by the Gamarekian testimony and by other White House documentation. She has said, over the years since publication, that she does not feel shame about what happened, that she was a young woman in an impossible situation, and that she has made her peace with it. Her account added something to the public understanding of the Kennedy White House that the grander, more mythologized affairs had somewhat obscured: the sheer ordinariness of the machinery. Powers pouring decuries. Young women invited to the pool. The First Lady's bedroom used because the First Lady wasn't there. The care and management of Kennedy's private life as a routine staff function, handled like any other executive scheduling problem. The banality of the whole operation was, in its own way, more unsettling than the glamour. What Camelot actually was. Jacqueline Kennedy coined the word Camelot in 1963 because she wanted the country to remember her husband's presidency as something worth mourning, as a brief illumination that had been extinguished too soon. She succeeded, perhaps more completely than anyone could have predicted. The mythology she created around those 1,000 days in the White House proved remarkably durable, lasting through decades of revelations about what else was happening behind the curtain. The Marilyn Monroe affair became part of American cultural mythology, a story of glamour and longing and death that almost nobody fully believed and almost everybody repeated. The Judith Campbell Exner affair carried with it real implications about the relationship between the presidency and organized crime, about the uses Kennedy made of the mob's resources and what the mob may have known or done in return, implications that historians and investigators are still working to fully resolve. Mary Pinchot Meyer left behind an unsolved murder, a diary that may or may not have been destroyed by a CIA counterintelligence chief in a Georgetown studio on the night she died, and a letter from the president that sold at auction 50 years after both of them were gone. Mimi Alford left behind a memoir that described the machinery of the Kennedy White House's hidden life, with a clarity and quiet composure that no government document ever could. The people around Kennedy, the aides, the security detail, the personal assistants who managed the logistics, maintained a code of silence for years that was eventually, gradually, broken. Not through any single dramatic exposure, but through the accumulation of memoirs and oral histories and declassified documents and biographies that came out over the decades after 1963. The picture that emerged was not the picture of Camelot. It was something more complicated, more human, and considerably more troubling than the fairy tale that had been constructed to replace it. It was also, in certain ways, more interesting, because the real story of a real person who made real choices under the weight of extraordinary power is always more interesting than the story of a knight in shining armor who never made any. Kennedy himself said things, in private, that suggested he understood the gap between his public image and his private conduct, that he recognized the difference between the story being told about him and the life he was actually living. He described himself to friends as someone who simply didn't function without the kind of attention he received from women, and who found in his marriage to Jackie a partnership of genuine mutual respect and considerable affection that nonetheless couldn't contain all of who he was. Jackie, for her part, maintained her composure and her dignity through the years after Dallas with a consistency that has its own kind of historical grandeur. She built the Camelot myth deliberately, and she protected it strategically. She knew what the truth was. She chose, for reasons that were entirely her own, to hold the myth in front of it. History has been pulling the myth aside piece by piece ever since. The real story of the Kennedy White House, the affairs, the mob connections, the classified relationships, the young interns and the murdered socialite and the Hollywood icon found dead in her home, is not a story that cancels the genuine achievements of those 1,000 days. The space program, the civil rights moral leadership, the Cuban Missile Crisis navigation. But it is a story that belongs alongside those achievements, honestly and without apology, because partial stories are not history. They are just myths in a nicer outfit. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.